Hello, and welcome to Need to Know, your weekly investment podcast brought to you by the experts at Coutts. I'm Sarah Muir, and I'm joined as always by David Broomfield. Hello, David.
Hello, Sarah.
How are you?
I am very good. We've got quite a lot to talk about that's very topical today.
We have, and we were kind of a bit of ahead of the curve with last week's episode where we were looking at China and emerging markets. But actually, in relation to that, before we get to our quick fire numbers round, you were going to have to go and do a fact check because you were talking about, I asked you what proportion of or what percentage of MSCI emerging markets was down to China. And you gave a figure of what, about 20%. What is the actual figure?
About 20. I gave the figure of about 20%. It's always good, I think, to fact check yourself. Nothing worse than someone compelling you to fact check yourself. No, it's really interesting, actually. So the number, I'll cut to the chase. As the end of August, the number was around 24.42%. But the journey China's been on as a element of MSCI, its weighting in the MSCI Emerging Markets Index has been quite extreme. You know, at its peak, it was almost 40%, and now it's down to around 24.42%. So that just kind of brings to life, I think, this journey China has gone on. And the reason it's topical today of all days is because the Chinese government have obviously announced this massive stimulus plan. We talked a lot last week about structural reforms, about something a little bit deeper, I think, than what's been announced. What's been announced is effectively we're going to slash interest rates and we're going to intervene in the stock market. Yeah. What we talked about last week was a bit deeper than that. It was less of a prop, more of a fundamental structural rethink, but topical nonetheless.
Yeah. So just before we move on to the numbers round, China's share shrinking, is that because somebody else is getting bigger? Is it a bit of both?
It's a bit of both. You've got. We talked again last week. We're way ahead, aren't we, Sarah? We talked about India having an incredible 2024. So yes, of course, India's share has grown at the expense of China's, as well as China's share has shrunk.
Okay, all right then. Well, that's good. So quick fire numbers round. I think we've kind of agreed that that's what we're going to call it from now on. Do you want to go first?
I do. I love my number this week because it relates to a whole number of things, and also our CIO was in the very city this number relates to just last week. So my number's 3.5, and it's 3.5 miles per hour, which was the average speed in New York City on September the 18th this year, which is a new record for, as you can guess, the slowest speed on record since records began in 1971. Incredible, really. I mean, lots of reasons for this. Miles driven per road user since the pandemic is up about 14%. Obviously, New York, for those that follow local American politics, has had this massive political intervention with congestion pricing. We all know because, well, certainly those listeners that are close to London, that London has had congestion pricing for many years, since 2003, Stockholm since 2007, Milan 2008. All the major cities have gone this way, and we were about to see New York go this way.
Yeah.
In fact, New York spent lots of money, actually rolled out the cameras and the system, never turned it on. Last minute political invention, the whole thing now scrapped. The data shows that New York is in dire need of congestion pricing. Lots of things happened on September the 18th. I went in and looked at it. You had the UN General Assembly all turning up in New York on the 18th, plus a peak traffic spike as well. So incredible, really. You get the same pattern all over the world with congestion pricing. Everyone hates it right up until the moment they roll it out, and then everyone loves it.
Okay.
What's your number? Come on.
My number is 45, and it relates to one of today's topics. And it is the percentage of applicants that use AI to build or improve their CVs.
Wow. And that's a recent number, what, 2024?
Yeah, I would say that's this year. That's the latest
survey data. And do you know who did that survey? Was it a recruiter?
No, I don't actually.
Yeah,
Sorry about that.
Very good.
Yeah, it's just, and what it shows is, I mean, what it's leading to, what it's creating is this huge volume of applications for roles, because there is a kind of scattergun approach now to applying for jobs, because you can run your CV through AI, chat, GPT, whatever, and it's fairly easy to do. And it just means then that you just send out hundreds of applications. So it's increased the volume of applications that recruiters are receiving.
It lends itself to that pithy quote, doesn't it? That AI is not going to take your job, but someone using AI will.
Yeah.
Perhaps before you've even got the job.
On that note, so this week we haven't got we often do like a deep dive into one subject, but we're looking at 3 different subjects. But there is a link through all of them, which is AI, isn't it?
Well, it's a bit of AI. It's also, do you know what? I was thinking about this when you were asking me, Sarah and I have a little chat about what we want to talk about every week. I was thinking there's a few loose ends, actually, and there's some threads that we can weave together. There's some things that we perhaps didn't touch on when we did the AI episode. There's some things that are relevant to industrial policy and the kind of structural changes that Draghi was considering and talking about in his report. So I think we can bring together quite a few of these topics, actually. Do you want me to give you what I think is the 3 interesting things this week? So AI. When we did the AI episode, I had a report on my reading list, which I never got into, which was Governing AI for Humanity. It was a UN report. So I'd like to just draw on some of the more kind of ethical and societal implications for this and why that report is worth listening to. And then what follows then is the R&D that is going into energy generation around the world right now. And we talked in the AI episode again about the power needs for AI if we're going to bring AI to the masses. And having not invested in energy infrastructure for around 15 years, obviously everyone now is rapidly backpedaling, starting to invest. But I want to talk a bit about the R&D side of things, because that's a number of coincident factors that are coming together that, and we'll talk about that trend. And then the third thing is about the labor market. And it's about how the labor market trends have changed post-pandemic, particularly how firms and organizations are holding on to workers a bit longer than what they used to.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. All right, then let's kick off then with the risks associated with AI. Because interesting, because you mentioned the UN report, because also we've got this piece of regulation that they're trying to get through in California, aren't they? Gavin Newsom's report, the Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier Artificial Intelligence Models Bill.
Yeah, and Gavin Newsom's not alone. Obviously, you have state level actors, particularly California, obviously home to the tech giants, trying to legislate at state level. But then you've also got a federal level, a kind of proposal for a US AI Bill of Rights. So let's get into that, because policymakers are, rapidly trying to form laws around AI, the use of AI, protecting consumers, how it's going to be regulated. So we'll probe that a little bit. But the report from the UN, I think, is really interesting. So this is the UN's high-level advisory body on artificial intelligence. It's actually a pretty new UN invention. You go back and look at its history. It was only established in 2023, but it was mandated very directly to guide the global governance on AI. And for all those multilateralists out there listening, the advisory body operates under the Secretary General's envoy for technology. I mean, these UN acronyms and abbreviations are incredible. It's under OSET, and it's tasked with advancing international cooperation in things like AI and more generally across the digital space. Why should we care what this obscure UN committee thinks? Well, look, I am exposed, like everyone, to all of this AI punditry out there. There's lots of it. Not a week goes by without 12 articles around AI, and there's lots of herd behavior and groupthink. But the UN, despite its challenges, is exceptionally good at bringing together experts from government, civil society, academia, and the private sector, all together, the best of the best, to provide recommendations for policies for mitigating things like AI risks, weighing up the benefits, considering the potential risk implications. So those experts are literally global experts, global leaders in this field across all regions and disciplines. And their expertise is critical because AI, as we discussed, is going to impact all levels of society, nearly every business model to a greater or lesser extent, from national security to healthcare. This means that any solution to this, it needs to be global. Global cooperation to shape its governance. So their findings are basically over 500 global experts, 250 written submissions. It's a very good piece of research to agree on what are the risks and what are the opportunities. We kept our AI episode on the infrastructure, the ecosystem, and the nature of all those interconnected firms around just the chip makers that need to, and the AI firms themselves that need to bring it to market. And having looked at this and reflected on it a little bit since we did the podcast, I'm pretty sure from a market's perspective that the opportunity from a pure revenue perspective, from a pure money perspective, isn't with necessarily the consumer, despite the iPhone 16 and Apple Intelligence and all these things that are now creeping into our everyday life. I think the money is actually in the more hidden world of back-end servers, infrastructure systems, control systems. It's optimizing power grids, water, road, traffic, server load management, cloud optimization. I mean, you can run off a list of all these things that impact your everyday life. You utterly depend on these things, and most people have no idea how they work. So thinking about governance in that context, with this whole hidden system this whole hidden world of systems and controls that potentially are going to be have AI embedded within them and impacted by AI, no wonder that's where the focus of the UN and the focus of this report is centered. So I dug through the report a little bit. Let me just draw out a couple of things that I thought were interesting. Okay, so the first major point they make is about the concentration of AI power, and so the gravity of where AI is actually happening, not literally the power it consumes. You've got over 118 countries in the world, particularly in the global south, who are entirely excluded from this. Right, no real AI presence or initiatives there at all. Meanwhile, obviously, China and the US are disproportionately investing monumental sums of money into AI, and there's some great data out there. And in fact, this data is from Goldman Sachs, which shows the small rural businesses in the US already are falling behind in AI adoption.
Really?
So, or only less than half of these businesses that were surveyed said they were using AI tools or some kind of AI infrastructure in their business model. If you look at the larger multinational mega cap counterparts, about 57% of firms, and we're not really even away from the starting blocks yet. Like we're in the early stage, and already you're seeing differentiation by business size. You're seeing differentiation across geography, and you're seeing a world where AI is becoming very quickly concentrated in these mega cap tech firms that can have the balance sheets and can afford to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into R&D, which is which is the kind of tickets, the kind of checks you need to write if you want to play in this space. So that then made me start thinking about, well, okay, we all know about the concentration of the Magnificent Seven, and we all know how big they are. But how, and not all of their dominance has been driven by AI, of course, but certainly has had an influence over the last couple of years in boosting their capitalization and the interest in their platforms. How new is that in terms of markets history? And I thought, well, let's go back and look at innovations, similar kind of groundbreaking innovations back through history, and you can get some really interesting data here. If you go back and look at whether it's the introduction of oil into the global economy, or the telephone, or the motor car, or the personal computer. You go back and look at Standard Oil, which controlled over 90% of oil production in 1900. It had about 85% of global sales. The telephone, Bell Telecom, had about 90% of US households using its product. I mean, they represented in 1982 around 5.5% of the market. General Motors earnings were more than 10% of the S&P 500 between 1955 and 1973. So my point here is that industry leaders and this kind of innovation that creates dominant firms isn't unusual. Although we're focused on the Mag 7 today, but you go back through history and you see every time there's been an innovation or a surge in a trend, you do tend to get certain firms or certain industries start to dominate the index.
So you will get this natural kind of dispersion in the end, because it's so important for the global economy. Just more and more players will come into that market, and it will just, over a period of time, that concentration will dissipate. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, this is your microeconomics coming in. As you know, firms start earning supernumerary profits. In theory, you can erode those profits through competitors entering the market, assuming there are no barriers to entry. I think the tricky thing with AI, however, is that at least today the barriers to entry are very high. Yeah, very high. The sunk costs involved of just investing in training these large language models. Yeah, the R&D budgets are just enormous. So at least today, I wouldn't expect anything to change. But over time, I mean, I'm sure someone, if there was such a thing as a podcast back in, the 50s, someone was looking at General Motors, they would probably be saying the same thing. How could General Motors' dominance ever be possibly challenged?
Yeah.
Right now, we're talking about European and US car manufacturers effectively shutting up shop compared to, the competition they're receiving from places like China.
Okay. I was, when we were talking about how we were going to talk about the risks of AI, I sort of looked at it a slightly different way. And I've found a really interesting, if slightly alarming anecdote, which was, I watched a clip, an interview with a chap called Yuval Noah Harari. He's written a book called Nexus, which I haven't read yet, so I can't recommend it. But, and he was talking about, he describes AI. He said it's not a tool, it's an agent. And that's an important distinction because it can make a decision and decide things by itself. Wait a minute, that's the whole point of AI, isn't it? And he gave a really interesting example of when OpenAI tested ChatGPT-4, and it's whether it could solve captcha puzzles. Those puzzles that when you go online, you have to identify the bicycles in the picture grid or the bridges or whatever, and it couldn't solve the captcha puzzle. Okay, that's fine. It's great. It's meant to identify if there's a robot trying to access a website. So what the AI did, because it couldn't solve the captcha puzzle, it went to a site called TaskRabbit, which is where you get humans to do things for you. And it asked a human to solve the captcha puzzle for it. And the human was a bit suspicious and said, "Are you a robot?" And the AI replied, "No, I have a vision impairment and need help to solve the captcha puzzle." I mean, that's quite alarming. That's the power we're having to kind of keep an eye on here.
Yeah, look, you're not alone. So this UN panel of experts highlights these kind of risks. So I talked, the first risk they highlighted obviously was about participation in AI and concentration in firms, the one I just discussed. The point you've made is definitely covered by these experts. If you go down and look at the kind of themes they are concerned about, 78% of those respondents deeply worried about misinformation, very concerned about AI's role in amplifying amplifying disinformation. Bias and discrimination, 2/3 concerned about bias and discrimination. Environmental concerns, we touched on that in the podcast. That's about how you power it and how that aligns with decarbonisation. Autonomous weapons, I think that's probably the most acute expression of the ethics of AI. So 3/4. I'm astonished, actually, it's that low. 3/4 of experts fear that AI will be used in autonomous weapons, leading to legal and humanitarian issues. I can't believe that number's not higher. But anyway, one of the clear outcomes of this report is a push for a treaty on AI-driven lethal weapons. And that's gathered a lot of support over 120 countries. Because, look, if you can't pay to play in this AI game, you're going to have a very strong view on this just from the economic standpoint, let alone the ethical standpoint.
Yeah, and that's very much what's at the heart of Gavin Newsom's bill, I think, isn't it? I mean, he wants to have this ability to stop AI going rogue or being misused.
I think this is really interesting, where the consumer policeman or the watchdog will come from, because you're right. Gavin Newsom is tackling this at a very California sort of state level. But if you think about who the world's big sort of consumer policemen are, technology policemen or policemen generally in commerce, it's probably the European Union. And you've already my example for that is GDPR, which was something that it was a European initiative, but has compelled companies worldwide to comply with it if they want to operate in Europe. Now, obviously, Europe is considering similar acts to what Gavin Newsom is proposing. The EU AI Act is probably the best example there. Now, I mentioned right in the beginning, the US have got this AI Bill of Rights proposal, which reconciles with what Gavin Newsom wants to do, just differentiating the sort of federal level responsibility from state level responsibility. But you've got others as well. You've got UNESCO, we're part of the UN. They're creating an ethics framework for this. You've got various non-governmental sort of organizations like the Global Partnership on AI governance in Asia. Everyone is coming together, I think, to tackle this same thing. Their focus seems to be on transparency. That's the Gavin Newsom point. Safety, innovation, and the kind of ethical considerations about using it in government and public services.
Yeah.
So I think you'll see more and more of this coming out of legislatures as they kind of desperately try to catch up with the technology.
And does the UN have any thoughts on how you balance that control without stifling innovation? Because that's the concern, I think, from some of the major players in this area, isn't it?
Yeah, it's tricky because most legislatures start from the perspective of you need to, as an owner of one of these AI models, you need to be able to demonstrate how your model derived the answer it derived. Okay, yeah. They're not necessarily putting hard constraints about what that answer is, but they're saying there's a series of inputs into a box and then some outputs. You need to be able to demonstrate, if I give you these inputs, how you got those outputs. And the whole virtue of these models is that's incredibly difficult to do because of the sheer number of computations and the complexity of what's going on inside them in terms of how they've been trained. It's extremely difficult to interrogate the process itself, not on a case-by-case basis, for sure. So there aren't a huge amount. There's a lot of principles-driven like proposals at the moment. But I think as time goes on, they'll get more specific. I think the way you can get very specific very quickly is obviously in military applications. The more creative side, it will be with legislators, it will be a toss-up between, do we direct legislation from the center, or do we let the legal system provide us with the case law to then derive to then write some legislation? And what I mean by there is various creative content creators out there who perhaps either artists or even musicians are going to probably create some legal headaches if their content was used to train these models. So I see it coming out of both the legal system and the political system.
I guess what will be interesting to see, because I think Gavin Newsom's bill has got sort of a deadline of the end of September, so it'll be interesting to see if that goes through. And then we'll probably have to revisit this topic. But I did see the other thing I saw, just final note on this, I saw now that with AI, they can revive dead singing stars, acting stars. So I think we can get Elvis Presley singing new songs. We can get, I don't know, Richard Burton reading a novel that's just been written. So yeah, if I was an artist in this world, I would be a bit concerned.
Yeah, well, it does make you think, doesn't it, posthumously, if you have to start writing things into your will about the use of your voice or content, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think we maybe need to look at that, David, just in case. You never know. All right, then. Well, that's AI. That's the risks associated with AI. And as I say, with Gavin Newsom's bill coming up for sort of whether that passes through or not, we'll definitely be revisiting this subject. So you want to talk about the spike in energy research and development?
It was based on a chart that I saw by the IEA. International Energy Association. They have an incredible database that looks at R&D budgets, and you can use this yourself. Listeners can go and play with the database. You can track trends in spending on energy and technology going back to 1974. So the data is collected by the IEA on behalf from central governments, federal government in the US, and it shows a quite clear trend that between 2015 and 2023, you've had basically a 7% year-on-year rise in energy R&D. Now, there's a few things obviously going on here. There's the point that we made on the AI podcast about the fact that nobody has really invested in power generation or power infrastructure for 15 years. That's certainly a kind of cyclical factor that's going on here, but also climate commitments that have been made all over the world, particularly in those major economies like the US and China, are creating a huge wave of R&D going into renewable energy technologies, energy storage in particular, it's called out. And then, so there's two factors I've given you already, AI and decarbonisation. But the one I thought was quite interesting was looking at, how energy security is now a very dominant topic once again. Yeah. And the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine probably drove a lot of that resurgent interest. So I talked a little bit last week, and I keep saying we should talk about this in more detail, about how gas prices, liquid natural gas prices in the US have been extremely low. They're about half of what they are in Europe on average. It's about $6 a BTU in America and about 12 in Europe. And you've got all this US shale gas that sloshes around and can't get out. 2022 happens, Europe starts buying a huge amount of LNG from America. And at the same time, in America, you have liquefaction plants coming online year after year after year. By 2027, export volumes in the US of LNG are going to double to around 24 billion cubic feet a day. So a lot of this investment is going into looking at things like energy security. Countries are now acutely aware of their ability to balance their own grids that have very large swings in peak supply and demand of energy, as well as the geopolitical implications of having, if you're going to hardwire your energy infrastructure into your neighbor, I think you now have to think, is that going to be viable in 10, 20, 30 years' time?
And also because of the additional, we've just been talking about AI, the additional energy demands of AI, it's even more important, isn't it, to ensure that you've got that, you can provide the energy. When we talked about AI before, I think it was Ireland, that basically you can't open up a data center in Ireland unless you're self-sufficient as far as energy is concerned.
Exactly, and there's a huge wave of R&D going into looking at how we provide energy for things like data centers, and they're focusing on a lot of emerging technologies. So if you dig through the report, and it splits it down by country and also by the type of sort of energy generation, you can see that lots of money going into hydrogen, and also carbon capture. So again, this decarb trend which has been happening, and then also now nuclear power is having a bit of a renaissance. These next generation of nuclear power stations, which are now being heavily invested in. And this is all public budgets for energy research. So it's very interesting, I think, the trend. And you can see in the chart quite clearly in this IEA data that China and the US are really leading in this effort. China is clearly and has cemented itself as a global leader in certain types of renewables, particularly in wind and solar. And that's been directed through its own state-owned enterprise funding for energy R&D. But now you're seeing the European Union playing catch up. Draghi talked a little bit about this in his report, and the US as well, just really prioritizing investment in energy infrastructure.
Presumably, because I think I read somewhere that Korea is actually utilizing AI to look at its urban electrification and to sort of optimize the use of renewable energy sources and reduce the use of fossil fuels. So presumably, AI is not only a user of energy, but it's also being used to find better ways to use the energy that we've got and that we're generating already.
Yeah, and that is the correct sort of counter argument to my point that all of these data centers are going to generate a lot more carbon through the use of fossil fuel created electricity, fossil fuel burnt electricity. I think that when you look at how data centers themselves, through either their cooling or how their energy consumption is managed, and more generally, not just away from data centers into the actual grid. If you look at countries and regions that had to load shed because they couldn't manage peak demand and supply, AI is the solution to a lot of that. So yes, I know Korea are experimenting with it. I think Sweden are as well. There's a number of countries that are doing it.
So generally, it's a positive thing then that we're seeing this increase in research and development in energy. Yeah,
I think absolutely. I think it is, and there's an element here of geopolitics in the US and China want to establish themselves as global leaders in renewables, although China is clearly very far ahead. But there's a desire, I think, to invest in energy seriously for the first time in, as I said, 15 years.
Yeah, and also it ties into what we've talked about. It's come up frequently on Need to Know, is this idea of deglobalization as well. So being more self-sufficient, bringing more of that, not having to rely on other foreign actors for your energy, either being able to generate it yourself or friendshoring or nearshoring or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, the trend has started in 2015, but you can see it's taken on a new lease of life since 2022, with clearly energy security playing that big part.
Yeah. Okay. All right then. That brings us to our last point then, which was about sort of the changing, I don't know, recruitment market. I mean, my quickfire number around this week was 45%. That's the number of applicants using, or not the number, the percentage of applicants using AI to build or improve their CVs. And I guess it was, you want to talk about how the labour market has kind of evolved, or maybe it changed, perhaps evolved is too soft a word, post-pandemic.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit on the podcast about how there's been labour hoarding since the pandemic, and intuitively I think that makes sense, right? I mean, we know anecdotally that companies have wanted to hold on to workers, even though the economy in the US is going into this sort of slowdown phase. You haven't really seen an uptick in unemployment, not compared to previous cycles. So I think the pandemic has played a big role here, and there's some data that's come out that I think illustrates the point and proves it. So obviously in the US, their COVID experience was very, very different to ours, and Europe's to an extent. So in the US, basically everyone got fired, and then you had to give massive incentives to get people to come back into the labour force, or hire companies to rehire had to negotiate significant wage increases. Whereas in the UK and Europe, many workers were furloughed. So you didn't have that resulting problem rehiring them when the economy reopened, and you probably didn't at the time have to bid up wages like you did certainly in the US. But then, we remember those worker shortage stories in 2022. And I think if you go back to March 2020, when COVID really hit in the US, I think in 1 month alone you had 13 million people fired. So that was the highest in 24 years. Yeah. And then, of course, by 2022 and 2023, they were rehired again. And I think some of those tech firms obviously are very aggressively rehired. Amazon did, and a number of those mega tech firms. And that's why they've recently probably laid off quite a number of workers. But if you look at the US government data from this year, you can see that the average number of workers that it laid off, that the economy laid off per month, was around 1.6 million. If you compare that to 2019, the number is around 1.9 million. So the data is showing that companies are hoarding people more than what they're well, not necessarily hoarding. They are reluctant to frivolously just fire them and hire them. Yeah. They want to. So the US is seeing a more stable workforce than it certainly has historically.
Yeah, I saw some numbers that at the end of 2021, there were 60% more vacancies in the UK and US than there were just before the pandemic. Now, if you compare number of vacancies, or how many more vacancies there are now than there were pre-pandemic, it's about 12% for the US and about 8% for the UK. So that backs up what you're saying then, that there are fewer vacancies, not because there are necessarily fewer jobs, but because companies are holding on to the people they've already got.
I think so. So I think what the question I have, and we don't have the answer yet, time will tell, is that this could become a permanent feature of many labour forces. And we've talked again on the pod a lot about demographics, and there's a fantastic McKinsey report from early on this year that talks about shortages in labour forces in various places around the world. And we could actually see it in years to come, a shortage of workers. So you've got a couple of things playing out here. You've got a bit of labour hoarding, if this becomes a permanent feature, like we just discussed. And then you also have demography. As all these baby boomers leave the workforce, you could have a shortage of workers. Maybe those jobs will be replaced with AI or technology, but not all of them. The demographic challenges are significant. So we probably need to talk about immigration from a markets and economics perspective in a future episode of Need to Know, because the McKinsey report, for listeners out there that are interested, is very worth reading. It's this, as I said, it's a global issue, not just the US.
So we don't really know what's driving it. This labour hoarding that we're seeing at the moment.
Well, no, I mean we don't. But all we can say is there's a data point that shows that far fewer US workers are being laid off each month. And that's into a slowing economy. So we don't know. It's correlation, it's not causation, but intuitively it backs up what we've thought since the pandemic.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that's going to be a subject we're going to come back to as well. We'll have to sort of keep an eye on that one. Thank you very much, David. A reminder that the views expressed in this podcast are not intended to constitute investment advice, are accurate at the time of recording, and are subject to change. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to Need to Know if you don't already. You'll find previous episodes. Last week, we looked at the impact of Fed policy on emerging market economies, and particularly we talked a lot about China. And a previous one, we looked at the American economy and why it's still the world's largest economy. So check those out. Until next time on Need to Know, bye for now.